I'm Executive Director of Oxford University's North American office, based in New York. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Wherever you are joining us from, we hope that you're well and that you and your loved ones remain safe and healthy during these challenging times. If anything, this pandemic has taught us is that it pays to prepare for the future. For the events that are on the horizon may not always be to our liking, and an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in many instances. Certainly we're seeing that today with our approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, but there are many other challenges on the horizon for humankind. One of the most daunting is the growth in population. And in the decades ahead, the human population around the world will grow significantly. And the very primary question we need to ask is, how are we going to feed all these people? And of course, one of the most important ways to look ahead is with preparedness and looking for answers based on hard science, based on fact, and based on research. And here, Oxford again can play an important role. So we're very pleased today to feature as our speaker, Dr. Stephen Kelly. Steve is an associate professor of plant sciences and a fellow of Queen's College. His research focuses on a very basic primary question of photosynthesis, something that we've all generally aware of in our existence, but don't really have a deep, profound understanding of. And that, of course, extends not just for the average person, but more deeply into science as well, and looking at the genes that control photosynthesis and that the role that they play in plant growth and in long-term sustainability. And so we thought it would be appropriate, just given the uncertainties facing us in the world, that we would invite Steve to say some words about his research and to explain to us the work that he and his colleagues are doing in looking at photosynthesis and how it can be adapted to help feed the world moving forward. As we go through the program, feel free to submit questions. I will be monitoring the chat feature. And so when Steve is done with his presentation, I'll begin the Q&A. And again, we'll go through as many questions as we can in the time allotted. But again, thank you for joining us. And now I'm pleased to turn the proceedings over to Dr. Stephen Kelly.
Wonderful, thank you, Mike. So yes, it's great to be here, and it's great to get to talk to you all about how we might go about feeding the world in 2050. It's not worth thinking too far ahead, but I think 2050 is a reasonable time that one could think about, and one could, as Michael said, plan accordingly, or think about how we might be able to plan accordingly. I'm going to try and share my screen now and see if we can get this working. Let's try that one. Share. PowerPoint presentation. Great. Oh, let's try that again. Let's share screen 2. That's hopefully displaying a PowerPoint presentation. Michael, can you confirm if you can see that okay?
I can.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, so I'm going to talk to you today a bit about how we might go about feeding the world in 2020 and how what we're doing in my lab here in Oxford will hopefully contribute a little bit to solving these challenges. So the first thing to define is really is how hard this problem is going to be. How hard can it possibly be to feed the world in 2050? I mean, we've been feeding the world for all of human history. And so why would we think that we might not be able to do so in 2050? Well, I'm just going to try and set the stage for what it might look like in 2050. So here's a plot that shows tracks human population in the world since 1950-ish until today. And you can see it fits pretty nicely to a straight line with an average annual increase of 1.1% to the human population. And while we're sitting at about 7.5 billion people today, that means that if we just follow this trend, the simplest possible model, follow this 1.1% annual year-on-year increase that we've been doing for the last 60 years, what would we look like in 2050? Well, there'd be somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people. 10 billion being the kind of everything stays the same estimate, and 9 being if it tapers off a bit slightly. So that's adding about 75 million extra people to the world every year, which is about the same population as we have in Germany. So we can visualize this as how many extra Germanys do we need to feed by 2050. We can give the world German measles, right? We can look at this and say, right, this is the actual amount of land and resource we need to invest or allocate to feeding the world by 2050, extra to what we're doing right now. And of course, we're not just increasing in population, we're all also eating more every year. So this is a plot over roughly the same time period of the average annual or the average daily calorific intake of a human being on planet Earth. And you can see that it's going up at a rate of about 0.6% per year, with a projected daily calorific intake for a human being on planet Earth in 2050 being about 3,400 calories. That might seem a bit high, but you got to remember that, you know, if I look at my grandparents, I'm about 6 inches taller than my grandparents. They were probably 6 inches taller than their grandparents. People are just getting bigger. We're not just getting bigger around the waist, we're getting taller. And taller, bigger people need more food. And so this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. As we get bigger, we need more food. And that's about 15 extra calories per day annual increase, which is only about a fifth of a slice of bread, right? That doesn't seem like much. But if we're all eating a fifth of a slice of bread more every year, well, that means we need 78 million loaves of bread extra every day next year, which is 15 million tons of wheat, which is 51,000 additional square kilometers of wheat that we need to plant next year. But if we decide to get those 15 extra calories a day with beef instead of wheat, then we need 2.3 million extra square kilometers of land dedicated to growing cows next year. And that's half the Amazon rainforest, right? Let's say we meet somewhere in the middle. Let's say we do 3/4 of our food comes from wheat and 1/4 of it comes from beef, let's say. So that would be about 500,000 square kilometers of land that we'd need to find next year, just even if the population stayed the same, just to meet the increased consumption demand. And that's about an area the size of France. So France is about 500,000 square kilometers. So in 2050, if the population, even if the population didn't increase at all, we would need this extra land for agriculture just to feed ourselves. So we're going to combine this. We're going to put population growth together at 1.1% with our consumption increase at 0.6%. And if you put those two things together, the simple maths just says that we're going to need 70% more food by 2050, because each of the 10 billion people that are going to be around on planet Earth are going to be consuming 16% more food per day than any of us do today, right? On average, not than any of us, but on average, the average person is going to be consuming 16% more food per person. So those two problems are combined. We need to find all this space for these extra people, and we need to find all this land for this extra food, right? It just doesn't fit. There just isn't that much space on planet Earth. But fortunately, crop yields have been improving, right? So it's not a case that we just need to take the crops that we've got right now and put more crops on more land, because yields are getting better, right? We're getting better at growing plants and we're breeding better growing plants. But how fast is that improving? And that's the key question. And crop yield improvement, if we average it across the major crops that sustain life on planet Earth, has tracked pretty much exactly on population increase. So it's about 1.1% yield improvement per year since 1960. And so it doesn't take much to see that if we have 1.1% population increase, 0.6% consumption increase, and we're only making a 1.1% yield increase, then we've got a gap here. And we have to plug this gap with devoting more land to agriculture. And so we can look at how much land has been allocated to agriculture and what the increase of that has looked like over the last 50, 60 years. And surprisingly, it's actually been slightly less than what you would anticipate from this kind of crude calculation here, you'd expect that we'd be going up at a rate of about 0.6% a year. But it's actually about half that. It's only about 0.3% land increase usage per year. So that's 0.3% extra land being allocated to agriculture every single year. So why is that? So why is it, okay, our crops are improving, but they're not keeping up with production or consumption? It's because we're changing, we're not keeping up with population increase or consumption. It's because we're kind of changing the crops that we're planting. So the crops themselves aren't getting better, but we're making better use of higher yielding crops. And just to exemplify this with cereals, so here is a plot on the left of the total land used for cultivation of the 3 most important cereals on planet Earth, wheat, maize, and rice. So we've got millions of kilometers on the left axis, and we've got the time scale on the x-axis. And you can see that over time, since the 1960s, wheat production, the land, not wheat production, but the land allocated to growing wheat hasn't really changed. The land allocated to growing rice has crept up a bit, but the land allocated to growing maize has been skyrocketing. And the reason for that is that maize is brilliant, right? It is very, very, very good at producing food. If you look at the graph on the right, from the maize and wheat occupy about the same amount of land on planet Earth, yet maize we're producing over 1,000 million tons per year for that land, whereas wheat we're producing about 750 million tons. And if we reduce that to tons per square kilometer, you could see that maize, if you were to just take the same bit of land and grow corn on it instead of wheat, you'd get an extra 50% compared to wheat, and you'd almost double the yield compared to rice. So we're making better use of higher yielding crops, and that's one of the ways we're plugging the gap. We're also reducing waste, is another way of plugging this gap. And there are other improvements in the production and speed of food from farm to fork that reduce waste in the system as well. So this is the reason why this isn't going up at quite the same rate as you would predict from the rate of population increase plus the rate of consumption increase. But 0.3%, is that really so bad? So we've only got a finite amount of land on planet Earth. So how much of it have we already devoted to agriculture? And what does that 0.3% really mean? If we just stay the course and everything just stays business as usual, what does that mean? So we can break down the Earth here into its various different categories. So 70% of the Earth is ocean, so we can't plant stuff on that. We've got 29% land, and of that 29%, only 71% of that 29% is habitable. The rest of that 30% chunk of land is in Antarctica and covered in ice, or is in the deserts, and you can't grow anything on it. So we've got barren, rocky landscapes like beaches and deserts, and we've got frozen deserts like in Antarctica, so frozen landscapes where we can't grow anything. So about 71% of the land is habitable, and we've already got half of that covered in farms. So 50% of the land that's habitable, that you could grow stuff on, is already covered in agriculture. About 1.5% of it's in our cities, and about 1% of it's in lakes. And that's what these little numbers are here that you might be able to see on the screen. And that leaves about 48% of it being wild. And that's our forests and our savannas and the last vestiges of natural habitat on planet Earth. If we stick to the course that we've set for the last 60 years, what's this going to look like? Well, in 2050, we're going to have about 59% of the world allocated to agriculture. We're going to gain about 10 million square kilometers of land in farms. That's 2 whole Amazon rainforests. We might lose a bit of land to climate change, but even, this is a fairly middle of the road model for what climate change is going to do. So this is about 5% of the arable land. So the land you could grow stuff on will be lost. It swings and roundabouts. We'll gain some land, we'll lose some land, but on average, it averages out about a loss of 5%, which means that we'll be left with about 33% of the world's natural habitats left. And that's a business as usual plan in 2050. That really doesn't seem good to me. And so what I want to do, and what I hope to do through our research in our lab, is radically change this. Because this land devoted to agriculture here is a huge contributor to this red bar over here, climate change. Because this land here is being planted essentially for combustion, right? So this is food that we grow up, we consume, and we turn it back into CO2. This is not CO2 that's being taken out of the atmosphere and fixed in the ground. So even though it looks like a really nice field full of lovely corn plants, all of that CO2 is going to go back into the atmosphere. And so this is a major, major contributor to this. And so if we really want to solve this problem, we really, really need to solve this problem. We need to radically reduce the amount of land that we've got invested in agriculture. And we need to let this, and we need to rewild this land so that it can be rewilded with forests and savannas and landscapes that actually soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I think we can really do this, because I think if we embraced our technologies and set about trying to double the yield of plants, we could achieve something that looks a bit like this. So if we doubled the yield of our world's most important crop plants, we could get to a point in 2050 where only 40% of the Earth's surface was devoted to agriculture. We could maybe cut back 10% on where we are now. That might have a good impact on climate change. I'm not going to say either way what that would be because I haven't modeled it. So I'm going to leave that climate change bar in here. But what it does mean is that we have the capacity, if we wanted to rewild a very substantial part of planet Earth. And that's something I'm quite passionate about. And then the world would look something a bit like it looked in 1950. So in 2050, we might be able to make the world look, if we're really, really devoted to this and find a way to double crop yield and start eating a little bit more plant protein, we might make the world look a bit like it looked in 1950. So how do we do this? How do we double plant productivity? Well, the easiest way to do it is to only grow maize, right? Maize is a fantastic crop. We could just say, right, people, stop growing wheat, stop growing rice, stop growing everything else. We'll plant maize, because then we could feed a global population in the, 13, 14, 15 billion, no problem. We've got a hugely productive crop here. But, life on maize doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me. Maize for breakfast, maize for lunch, and maize for dinner, and not much else, maybe a vitamin tablet just to keep you from getting deficiency disease. But what we could do instead is what I would like to think we could do is radically improve photosynthesis in our major crops, right? So take all the diversity that we love in our food and radically improve how fast they grow by altering and improving photosynthesis in these food crops. Because photosynthesis is the way that the earth gets its energy, right, from the sun. It's the way that all consumable energy enters the food chain, bar some niche microbes that live in deep sea hydrothermal vents. Otherwise, every bit of consumable energy comes via photosynthesis and then passes up through the food chain via, being consumed by very different organisms, different trophic levels. And it's essentially, conceptually, a very simple process. You just take energy in terms of photons and light from the sun, take CO2, which is our carbon source in terms of oxygen, CO2 from the atmosphere, and you glue it, use the energy from the sun to glue those carbons together to create sugars. That's it. You need some water from the soil. But the thing is, not all plants are particularly good at photosynthesis. So here on the right, we've got a graph that shows the absolute maximum photosynthetic rate of a plant for a whole diverse range of plants where it's been measured. And this is a very good representative range of plants on Earth. And most plants are not particularly good at photosynthesis. We've got some superstars up here, which do very high rates of photosynthesis and grow really fast and produce very high biomass. And we've got plants that have very low rates of photosynthesis that hardly grow at all. And we're all really, I think, acutely familiar with this from if you've ever had a garden and you've got weeds that are constantly shading out stuff, and you have to rip them out because they grow so fast. But the beautiful little plant that you want to grow grows really, really poorly and very, very slowly. So you have to kind of protect it. And the same is true, you know, just plants just have a wide variety in their maximum photosynthetic rates and photosynthetic efficiencies. And when we were domesticating, or when our ancestors were domesticating crop plants 10 to 15,000 years ago, they weren't going around going, oh, that one grows really well. We should try and domesticate that, guys, because then we'd have a huge amount of food. They were going around going, that tastes brilliant. Let's plant more of that. And what tastes brilliant and what grew really well 10,000 years ago, the Venn diagram of that doesn't really overlap very well. In fact, there's only one thing that seemed to taste good that grew particularly well at all, and that was maize. And that's why it's one of our most high-yielding crops when we grow it out there. But if you look at the photosynthetic rate of all these other things, they're all either average or very poor. And so there's scope, or I believe there's scope to improve the photosynthetic rate of all of these crop plants, including maize. And what I want to do is tell you a little bit about how we go about doing that. And to do that, I'm going to take you on a bit of a detour via animal evolution. So how do we go about learning how to improve photosynthesis in these plants? The trick, how do we take something that might be down here and bump it all the way up here and increase the rate at which it grows and the amount of food that it can produce? Now, to do this, I'm going to take you on a bit of a detour to help you understand something that might be a bit more familiar to everybody. And that's animals. So we're animals, and we generally, I can show you loads of plant species, but how many people would recognize one plant species from another? But I can show you loads of animals, and it will make a lot more sense. So here is a phylogenetic tree of all the major groups of animals here. We've got things like kangaroos, dugongs, elephants, we've got tigers, camels, stuff like that. And this tree describes the relationship between all these major groups of animals. So we can see if you're closer on this tree, then you're more closely related, right? So the rodents are very closely related to the rabbits, and primates are closely related to things like flying squirrels and stuff like that. And our kind of expectation when we think about Darwinian evolution and evolution by natural selection is that things that are closely related to each other should be really quite biologically similar to each other. And things that are distantly related to each other should be really quite different. That's what we kind of expect, because we think of evolution as this kind of radiation process, and everything's exploring these spaces that are all just getting progressively more different from each other. And while some cases that's true, it's also in many cases not true. Because all these organisms aren't evolving in a spherical vacuum where everything they could possibly need is provided. They're evolving in defined ecological niches where they're all trying to solve the same challenge of survival in that niche, right? They're all solving they're all experiencing the same environment. They're all experiencing the same food sources, and they're all coming up with pretty much the same solutions no matter where they start, to surviving in this environment. And that means that if we plot biological similarity against evolutionary distance, we don't see a straight line. We don't see that the most distantly related organisms on this tree have the most different biology. We see the fact that distantly related organisms on this tree that adapt to the same environments end up converging on the same bits of biology. So sure, while close relatives can be very similar to each other, distant relatives are not necessarily very dissimilar to each other. And just to illustrate this, here we've got like a dugong on the tree here, which is a manatee which adapted to life living in the sea. And down here we have, in the carnivora, we've got otters and seals and things like that. They've also adapted to life in the sea. And down here down where we've got camels and whales, you've got the cetaceans that adapted to living underwater, right? So you've got independent adaptations of very distantly related organisms that have adapted to the same environment and come up with the same solutions, changing their anatomy, changing their physiology to enable them to hold their breath longer, changing their anatomy to make themselves swim faster, and adapting to similar food sources in some cases. And that's led to a convergence in their biology. And they've come up with the same solutions to doing this. And this fact that organisms that are really distantly related, if you put them in the same environment, end up coming up with the same solutions to surviving in that environment, it's called convergent evolution. And it means that when you take the 3 most distantly related organisms on this tree, they can all be moles. So at the top here, we've got like a marsupial mole, which is essentially a kangaroo that evolved to live underground. It lost its eyes, it's got big digging front arms, it's got a great sense of smell, it's got fur that points backwards, it digs around under the ground, it's about yay big. And then down here, we've got the common European mole, which is essentially a subterranean, oh, that's the golden mole, sorry. That's pointing in the right place, yep. Which is much, much, much more closely related to an elephant than it is to this guy up here. And it has the same kind of traits as this guy up here. It's got lost its eyes, got a great sense of smell, got huge, powerful front arms here that points backwards, digs around underground, eats insects, is about yay big, lives about the same amount of time. And we've got the same thing going on down here in the European mole, which is a hedgehog that decided to live underground, lost its eyes, great sense of smell, big, powerful front legs, digs around, hair points backwards. All these all the same solutions to the same challenge of surviving underground. And this is convergent evolution. So biology doesn't do patents. It doesn't stop the fact that this organism evolved a certain set of traits by manipulating its genes, doesn't stop this organism evolving exactly the same set of traits by manipulating its genes. Biology doesn't do patents, it just does trade secrets. And that means that this kind of convergence is absolutely everywhere in the tree of life. When you hear about antibiotic resistance, that's convergent evolution. It's bacteria coming up with the exact same solutions to survival in the faces of the presence of antibiotics. Even in humans, there's loads of examples of convergent evolution. Even our ability to drink milk into adulthood has evolved multiple different times in different human populations by changes, exactly the same genetic changes. And we even see convergent evolution of really complex traits, like the eyes in vertebrates and the eyes in squids have remarkably similar structures in terms of retinas and corneas and lenses and all sorts of, the kind of images they form are completely, really very similar, but they evolved from completely independently, right? Completely independent evolutionary origins came up with this, when faced with the same challenge of trying to see stuff, it came up with the same solution. And even really simple things, or comparatively simple things, like the wings in bats and birds evolved from arms completely independently. So biology comes up with solutions to problems repeatedly all the time. And it's not only in this, it's also in plants. So if I show you this picture of a beautiful desert, you might think, oh, that looks really nice. When I look at this, I see 50 different plant species that have come up with the same solution of living with very, very little water. When I show you this, you might think, oh, it's a cool pond, that's very nice. And what I see is 10, 20 different plant species that have come up with the same solution of living with too much water. And if you look at the way plants grow even, you might look at this and say, oh, you know, here's some germinating seedlings. You can have a look at this and you can see some of these grow quite quickly. You've got a barley seedling on the left, which grows really fast or shoot off the top of the screen. We've got these guys, which are growing pretty well. We've got these guys, which are barely growing at all by comparison. By the end of this same experiment, it's got half or a quarter of the biomass of these plants over here, or even less. So when I look at this, I see these convergent solutions to growing quickly happening as well. So this is what we do in my group. We develop a lot of software and tools and approaches to reverse engineering the convergent solutions that organisms have come up with to solving the challenges of surviving in the environment. So what we're really interested in is how things, you know, in that desert example, for example, how do plants from completely different plant families end up in the same environment and solve the problem of living with very little water? Because they're going to solve it in essentially the same way every time, or a very limited set of ways. And so we develop a lot of software to do this. And one of the things I'm going to tell you about that we work on in the lab is a convergent evolutionary trait in plants called C4 photosynthesis. And we've been working on reverse engineering this one. So C4 photosynthesis, what is it? I'll give you a very, very brief overview. So most plants don't do C4 photosynthesis. That's point one. Most plants, you can think of them as a whole big pile of algae all glued together, because every single photosynthetic cell in that plant is autonomous and does all the reactions it needs to do photosynthesis by itself. So every cell sits there, takes up CO2 from the atmosphere, makes sugars. That's it. And C4 photosynthesis is just a tiny modification of that, where we have a little bit more complexity, where photosynthesis is now split between two cells. So we've got a cell here which still does photosynthesis, takes CO2, makes sugars, but the cells next to it have stopped doing photosynthesis and instead act as a kind of delivery pump cell. So what they specialize in is taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and then just shoveling it into this cell so that it can be fixed. So it costs more energy to set up this system, but once you've got the logistics of pumping CO2 in, it's more efficient. And the plants that do this kind of photosynthesis have reorganized the entire internal structure of their leaves so that these blue carbon pumping cells here completely surround these green photosynthesizing cells here. And it acts as a natural turbocharger. So it takes CO2 that's at a low concentration in the atmosphere and concentrates it really, really high in these cells that are doing photosynthesis and that are conveniently placed right around the veins where they've got water being pumped into them. They got water being pumped in one side, they got CO2 being pumped in the other side, and these cells do photosynthesis like absolute stink. They're brilliant at it. And it's the trick and the secret to maize's astonishing high yield, right? Maize is brilliant at growing because it does this trick. And what I want to do is take this trick that loads of plants have come up with and engineer it into our world's most important crop plants. Because if we could put this naturally occurring CO2 pump into other crop plants, we could turn these into super high yielding plants too. And the great thing about it is, this is a convergent trait. It didn't just evolve once in maize. If we look at the land plant phylogeny, which I've shown here, this is a whole phylogenetic tree of land plants, which each species shown in black. On it, I've marked the C4 plants in red, and you can see, and around the outside, I've indicated the number of independent evolutionary origins of C4 photosynthesis that there are. And you can see that there have been at least, and on the current count, it's at least 67 independent origins of this carbon pump system, where the plants have figured out how to restructure the internal anatomy of the leaf and now drive CO2 from the atmosphere into the cells where it's being fixed by photosynthesis and massively improve their nitrogen and water use efficiencies and their rate of photosynthesis. So what we do in my lab is we try to reverse engineer this. Evolution has invented it 67 times. All we need to do is go out there, look at the data, compare it to the controls, and reverse engineer how it's gone about doing this, and then recapitulate that evolution in organisms where it hasn't happened yet. And so that's what we do. And I'm going to give you two tiny stories of successes that we've been having in reverse engineering C4 photosynthesis. And the first was we needed to figure out what was the actual biochemical pathway of C4 photosynthesis. Because even though it was discovered as a phenomenon over 50 years ago, we hadn't actually worked out the biological mechanism by which how CO2 got from the outside, got packaged into this compound malate, which then gets delivered into this cell, and CO2 gets unpackaged, and then the packaging gets sent back to be refilled with CO2 again. So we got this cycle. And this cycle pumps that CO2 from outside into this region of the cell here where the photosynthetic engine is. But when we looked at this, we were missing components of this engine. You can't build an engine if you don't know all the components. And we were missing these two valves that allowed this package that contained the CO2 in, and then the valve that let the package back out again. So using our reverse engineering approaches, we were able to identify that. And it turned out to be not one valve, but a nice bidirectional valve that lets one component in a perfect stoichiometric change for letting the other one out. So now we have a complete C4 pathway for the very first time, which we're very excited about. And we've started to engineer aspects of this C4 pathway into plants already, because there's parts of this pathway that will function beneficially in plants without even having to implement the entire cycle. And so we've already started to engineer, take what we've been finding from reverse engineering C4 photosynthesis and start installing it into plants that don't do this. And we're already seeing huge gains in photosynthetic efficiency in these plants. So here's an example of one of these aspects of C4 photosynthesis that we've installed in non-C4 plants. And we've been able to boost photosynthetic rate by about 35% in these plants, which has directly translated into faster growth and higher yield in the lab. And we're currently trying to commercialize some of these technologies by getting them into our some of the world's most important food plants. So this is what we want to try and do. We want to reverse engineer nature's already solutions that it's already come up with for improving productivity of plants, improving how plants respond to drought, improving how plants deal with differences in environmental conditions. They've already done it. Plants have figured this all out. We just need to figure it out how they did it and then implement these solutions in our important crop plants. And I really think that even if we could just get this one trait that we've discovered into crop plants around the world, we'd already go, this would hopefully do something along the lines of what we see in the lab of producing a 30% boost to yield reduction with a 5 to 10% reduction in the amount of time it takes to produce that yield as well. And hopefully this will go to some way to solving what I really think is the biggest problem that we're going to face. If we just stay the course and keep planting more land, keep cutting down the lungs of the planet in order to feed us, eventually this is just going to burn out. There just is a finite amount of space. There's a finite amount we can cut down before we don't generate enough, before the climate gets completely out of control and before we run out of air, essentially. So I think we can really radically do this, and we can do this in a not crazy amount of time by just reverse engineering the natural solutions that occur in plants or in the world's most productive plants already. So I'm going to end there and thank everybody for listening so far, and thank the funders who've supported the work in my group over the years, so particularly the Royal Society, who's funded me over the last 5 years, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who fund our work into C4 photosynthesis, the ERC, who funds our work into understanding the actual molecular components and the engines of photosynthesis, which we didn't get time to talk about today, and the BBSRC, which funds some of our more translational work that looks at engineering photosynthetic enhancements. So I'll take any questions that might have appeared. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Steve. That was really fascinating. I know I, for one, don't want to eat maize or corn for every meal. And so hopefully your work will yield wonderful results and allow us to maintain our varied diets. Questions, I have a very basic, straightforward question from Paul Mortimer. Hello, Paul. Will Professor Kelly address the fact that some recent forecasts of population growth suggest that the 2015 world population may be no greater than the present population? So is it guaranteed that the world population will be bigger in 2050 than it is now?
I don't think anything is guaranteed, right? I think forecasting is always a dangerous area to kind of venture into. And we've seen that a lot with forecasting kind of COVID predictions of what might happen, especially at the early stages where these various models were forecasting, oh, everything will be fine in 2 weeks, or oh God, it's going to be awful. It's very hard to forecast this. But if we look back on what's happened over the last 60 years, it's been remarkably consistent. And so you'd have to have a very strong reason, in my opinion, to say that human behavior is going to radically change to the point where we won't just see a continuation of how we've behaved over the last 60 years. So I definitely think population will increase. I really hope it doesn't hit the predicted 10 billion. I would be really surprised if it didn't hit at least 9 billion by 2050.
Okay. Interesting. Another question from Professor Raul Ponce Hernandez involves the critical role of water, one of the more critical factors, if not most critical factor of photosynthesis. In 2015 will be water and water scarcity. Assuming the permanence of current climate modeling science and the wide range of uncertainties involved in their projections, how would you engineer, genetically or otherwise, any photosynthetic outcomes, accounting for what seems to be a moving target if one is to consider the substantial ranges of variability of the climate projections for each place in the planet?
Okay, that was a long question. So I'm gonna try and answer the bit about water use efficiency. Yes, water availability is critically limiting. We are depleting aquifers and fresh water sources at an alarming rate. And there are multiple ways in which we can address this. So pretty much all of our crops can be improved for water use efficiency, particularly C4s. There's aspects of their physiology that make them well suited for improving water use efficiency. And that's definitely one of the targets that we have in our group, is improving the water use efficiency of C4 photosynthesis as it stands. Converting plants from C3 to C4 would come with a huge boost to water use efficiency, because the plants themselves use less water than C3 plants under equivalent conditions. So C4 photosynthesis in itself would actually be a water use efficiency trait. Even if it didn't produce an enhancement in yield, it would produce a saving in water. But you're absolutely right. Where are we going to get this water from? So if the climate models are correct, water is going to become extremely limiting. And so there are not very many extreme water use efficient plants, like I showed you there, the cacti, that we rely on for food production. So we've got agaves for tequila and things like that. Prickly pears gives us, from the Opuntia cactus and stuff. We don't have many super dry crop plants. And so this, I think you're absolutely right, is going to be a really major challenge, and something that we're very focused on as well.
Keeping with the water theme, similar questions from Patrick Shea, and I lost the other one, from David Meyer, about what about farming the ocean and using aquaculture as a place for growing food, and will it make any appreciable dent in this problem?
Yep, so loads of plant species have figured out how to grow in really highly saline environments. So nature has already come up with these solutions, and people have started to engineer similar kind of salt tolerance traits into crops like rice, where they're highly prone to saltwater ingression and flooding from the sea. Because, if you have this, rice is grown on these estuarine or floodplain areas quite often, and it's not too hard for a freak wave to come in or flood everything and then salt the earth, right? And then you have a huge problem with growing rice on that land. And so there's a huge incentive to actually making more salt tolerant crops. So if you could make them super, 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 super salt tolerant, and then you could come up with the technological solutions for growing them hydroponically in super, super, super salty water, then I don't see any reason why one couldn't do it. Whether it becomes economically viable to do it is a different question. And certainly we could grow marine algae as a source of protein, as a source of fixed carbon in saltwater environments. And if that could be used, say, as food additives or animal feed particularly, we might not appreciate the taste of it very much, but cows and pigs and chickens might not mind too much. We might be able to find a way to sustain meat production through that.
Interesting. Sort of changing gears a little bit, Michael Clark raises the question about food waste, and obviously a huge amount or a huge percentage of food wasted each year. And do you foresee much change in this area? And will it help to meet extra demand by 2020?
Yeah, I think so. So the food waste numbers for different countries are quite different. And they vary, I think. In the US and the UK, they're not too dissimilar. And they've been going down generally over the last few years as people have become more aware of this, but also as technologies and the speed of food packaging, production, and storage have improved, food waste has gone down. So currently, my understanding from current estimates is it's about 10% of food is going to waste. And it could be a couple of percent either way on that. So there, if we could capitalize, if we could recover all of that, we could get 10%. But that's the limit. But it's part of the solution. Even if we could get half of that, 5% would be an amazing amount of food that would be salvaged. So it's well worth, it would be even worth chasing single, 1% of that. If we could get it down from 10 to 9, that would be a huge success. So, but I don't think it will be possible to get it to 0. But I think the number we could get is between 1 and 5%. So it would be a contributor for sure.
A couple of similar questions, one from Patrick Shea and one from Suzanne Webster-Roberson about genetic engineering, its potential impact on the genome, but also drawbacks. Does this engineering have potential drawbacks in terms of out of control plants, such as the kudzu vine that is taking over parts of the United States? So are we playing with fire sometimes, I guess is the question, genetically modifying plants in certain ways?
Sure. I mean, this is a valid concern that I think people have about modifying the properties and the genetic properties of organisms. And I think, the where I side on this is, So where I side on this is I think it's essential. So I think I can't see a way in which we can address future food need without resorting to technological solutions, of which one will be genetic modification. And so long as the traits are extremely carefully examined and controlled, then escape should essentially, the risk of escape and the risk of out of control taking over of the surface of the earth is essentially negligible. It's not like people are engineering super weeds to be even weedier. We're engineering the things that we want to eat that generally don't survive now. They've been domesticated to the point where they don't really grow. Like you don't see very much in the way of wild wheat or maize grown around on the roadsides, or wild rice, escaped domesticated rice, I should say, rather than wild rice. Doesn't do very well outside of agricultural situations. So I think so long as the trait is regulated and evaluated on a trait-by-trait basis, and by the way, I think that kind of level of scrutiny, if we're going to apply it to GM traits, should be applied to plants, irrespective of how they've been generated. Even if they're generated through traditional means, if they're not evaluated to the same level of safety that a genetically modified trait is, then how do you know that this plant you've bred isn't going to escape and take over the world, right? It could easily, just as easily as a genetically modified trait. You're just making a plant by a different approach. So we need to regulate. If we get to the point where we're producing these huge, super fast growing, super high yielding plants, then they need to be regulated and just like anything else that you would release into the world.
Okay. Similar questions from Max Mutter and from William Kroger. Will more photosynthetically efficient crops require additional inputs such as fertilizer and reapable benefits? William Kroger is sort of a two-part question. What do we know about the relationship between C4 photosynthesis in plants and the plant's nutritional value? And if we are able to speed up the process, will this also mean speeding up the rate in which plants consume nutrients? So again, will these plants require more care? And do your models involve a difference between monoculture and mixed plantings?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you just take a normal C3 plant and you boost its photosynthetic rate without improving the efficiency of that photosynthesis, so if you're just saying, let's just put more fuel through the engine, or let's build a bigger engine, yes, you need more resources proportionally to the size of that engine. So if you build a bigger engine that's not any more efficient, then you're just going to consume more resources. You'll need more nitrogen, you'll need more water. So that's not what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do is improve the efficiency of that engine. What we're trying to do is get more CO2 pulled down out of the atmosphere and stuck into the grain as a function of the resources that that plant has. So the plants that I've shown you on the previous slide are not just higher photosynthetic rate, they are achieving that higher photosynthetic rate for the same resource use investment. So they're achieving it, so they have a higher water use efficiency and a higher nitrogen use efficiency. And that's one of the great things about C4 photosynthesis and why we have it as one of our targets, is because C4 plants are about 50% more water and nitrogen use efficient than C3 plants, because they're able to, because the efficiency of that photosynthetic reaction has been improved. They don't need to invest quite so much in building such a substantial engine to achieve the same growth rate. So overall, you get an improvement in water and nitrogen use efficiencies. So even if we took wheat and made it C4 and there was no difference in yield, we would have halved the amount of water and nitrogen that wheat plant needed. So I'm hoping we achieve all three. I hope we boost the yield, and while simultaneously reducing nitrogen fertilizer, nitrogen and water use. But some of the solutions that people are coming up with, and indeed that we're coming up with as well, will require more inputs. And so that just needs to be carefully thought about in terms of where you're targeting that particular solution for, right? If you're building a plant that has an engine that is essentially hungrier, so it's going to need more nitrogen, it's going to need more water, then that plant's not going to be well suited for arid, nutrient-poor environments. That plant's going to be well suited for rich farmers in highly well irrigated areas where they can purchase fertilizers and have access to readily available water. We're generally not working in that space, and we're generally working in the space of higher efficiency. But that doesn't mean that people won't come along and make these higher, just higher throughput traits that require more resources.
I guess other people like me don't want to just eat corn or maize. So a couple of questions related to how abundant or how widespread this technique can be applied. So Jim Foraker, sorry Jim if I've got your name wrong. Can all our current crop species be photosynthetically enhanced, or are reverse engineering methods limited to specific types of crops? And Frederick Hodges asks, will your techniques work in fruit trees or only cereal grains?
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that all plants can be improved for photosynthetic rate and efficiency. If we look at the natural diversity that's out there in the world, there's no reason to assume that the world's fastest photosynthesizing plant right now is the upper limit. Its photosynthesis is driven by a 3,000 component engine, and to assume that every single component in that engine is perfectly optimized would be to assume that that plant has only had one kind of constraint it's been evolving against its entire existence, and that's to grow as fast as it possibly can. And I don't think that's a realistic expectation. And if we look at our crop plants, even like maize is nowhere near the top end of that spectrum. So maize can do, an elite cultivar of maize can maybe do 55, 60 micromoles of CO2 per second. But one of the worst weeds that we have around the world, Amaranthus palmers almaranth, is doing 80, 85, 90, so it's driving nearly twice as fast as our best crop plant. And most of our crop plants are down there at about doing 15 miles an hour, just kind of trundling around, not really growing at all. And so I think there's such a huge scope to improve photosynthesis. And nature tells us that those values are achievable.
Mike Wegner asks, can you discuss how your solution might actually be rolled out around the world?
Yeah, so at the moment we've only delivered, so we've got a number of traits in the pipeline, some of which we're trying to commercialize right now. And we're trying to commercialize them via two different approaches. So via genetic modification, which is the kind of standard approach that people are familiar with, and also via new technological approaches called genome editing, which require much more tailored and precise changes to the genome. So rather than inserting a big chunk of genetic material, we just go in there and we flip one or two bases to change the regulation of the machinery that the plant already has. So what we're doing is we're not adding anything in that the plant doesn't already have. We're just changing the timing of when it uses the materials that it's got. So it's like getting your car and taking it to someone who reprograms the CPU in the car to make the engine run a bit faster. That's basically what we're doing. We know, we've looked at how nature has solved the problem of being more efficient. We've reverse engineered it. And now we're just going in and we're making a few changes to the genome of the plant itself to make better use of its own genetic code. So we're not actually adding in anything that it doesn't already have.
So we're running just about out of time. A couple more questions. Ethics. Patrick Shea asks, does Professor Kelly have any ethical guidance for his research? And I might add on to that, ethical guidance, perhaps, that we can apply from your research.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that absolutely needs to be addressed if we get to the point of actually ever being able to implement these technologies in the real world. So if we can, so the ethics of, so doing the experiments in the lab is a very different kind of set of ethical considerations to then taking the results from those experiments and then applying them to plants in the real world. And so it's something that we're acutely aware of and very concerned about. And it falls hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier about regulation, I think. For me, it does. So, you know, we're regulating the trait and not the technology. So we should think about what this plant could do in the environment and how the environment might react to this plant, rather than saying, well, we just can't grow it because it was generated using technology X. And so I think the ethics and the regulation all kind of intertwine at the point where you want to take something that's a good idea in the lab and translate it to actually releasing it in the field. So at the current point where we're at, we don't have very much experience in managing or the kind of ethical considerations of that larger scale transition, because that seems to us to be still a very long way away.
Shifting gears a bit, but a nice personal question. Daniel Minshew tells us that he grew up on a tree farm in Georgia, USA. His grandfather's goal was to plant 1 million trees a year, aware that the last harvest, of course, would be 40 years later. Do you have any opinion on the importance of trees in 2050?
Yes. So this is something that's really hard to get right? Because you're planting a crop for harvesting at the earliest possible point in 20 years' time, right? So even Sitka spruce, which will be our fastest growing crop, I'm not sure what the minimum possible harvest time is, but it's got to be 20, 25 years or something like that. And I apologize if that's wildly out. It's really hard to know. So like in the UK, for example, if you look across the UK, it's covered in Sitka spruce plantations. A lot of them are remnants of when mining was booming and people were going to need more prop shafts for mines. So we'll plant loads of Sitka spruce because it makes really good prop shafts for digging coal mines throughout the UK, and the coal mine industry was killed overnight. Now we've got all this Sitka spruce that we don't know what to do with, right? To a large extent. So planning what timber resources you're going to need for a long term like that is challenging. And one of the things we want to try and do is see if our technology works in trees as well. Because what we see in non-trees, so in annuals, is a 30 to 40% boost in photosynthesis, which translates to, and certainly in annuals, a 10 to 15% reduction in the time it takes for them to grow to maturity. And so if that was the case in trees, we'd take quite a substantial chunk out of that growth cycle. And also then that would de-risk your investment in terms of what you're going to plant, because you're planting it for sooner rather than later. very hard to think about trees. I find it very hard to think about trees. It's such a long term.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, one of the downsides of this format is we can't all applaud. So I will applaud everyone. Thank you, Steve, for that fascinating presentation. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I guess sometimes it's a good sign that there's so many questions we can't get to them all. We will be putting up a slide with contact information for Steve and his lab. So if you'd like to contact him, he's graciously said to feel free to do so. You saw one of his slides, he does have philanthropic support from a number of organizations, but more philanthropic support is always welcome. So if you are interested, feel free to contact Steve, or you can always contact me at through our website, which is oxfordna.org. But with that, again, I thank you, Steve, for this fascinating presentation, and encourage all of you who've joined us today to look out for more of these webinars, check our website, check our postings on social media. But again, on behalf of all of us in the North American office and on behalf of Dr. Kelly, thank you for joining us today.